Hi friends, it's Alexa. I love books, and we're here today to talk about books and manga. Basically, we're here to talk about all of the things that I read last month in March, and it was an interesting reading month. We had some really good books, we had some rereads, we had some books that were unexpected, and we also had books that were not necessarily my favorite. But anyway, we're just gonna get going. I've decided to structure this video differently from what I normally do, which is just sort of in order of how I read it, unless there are series, in which case I group those together. This time we're gonna sort of do something different in that I'm gonna start off by talking about the books that I buddy read with other people, specifically the two buddy reads I always do every month, and then we're gonna kind of just go from there. I'm gonna separate out the books that I pulled off my TBR from the new releases, from the manga, as well as a reread that will be the end of the video. So without further ado, let us talk about the two books that I read or buddy read with other people last month. The first book that I'll be talking about today is the one I read for Family Book Club. We have been keeping up very well with the book club since we started it in the pandemic, and I really appreciate that it has allowed me to broaden my horizons a little bit when I'm reading, just because the other members of this book club read different genres or find different things interesting than I do. The book that we read this month is The Things You Can See Only When You Slow Down, which is by Heimin Sunim, and I really love this cover and this aesthetic. There's actually a few art pieces sprinkled throughout the book, which I really enjoyed as well. Basically, this author, Heimin Sunim, is offering guideposts towards well-being and general happiness, and he particularly focuses on different aspects of people's lives. When I went into this one, I didn't really have any strong expectations. I tend to take these sorts of books with a grain of salt. Like, I generally just try to see if I feel like I'm resonating with some of the concepts that the author is presenting, or if I feel like the author is giving some language to things I've felt maybe but never known how to express. Those are the things I tend to look for, you know, apart from the practical advice that any book can offer. This was an interesting one for me because normally, considering the length, I would have just blasted through it. Even the way it's formatted lends itself well to reading it really, really quickly, and I probably could have finished this in a day. However, at the author's recommendation, I decided, you know, I'm going to take my time a little bit with it, go section by section, try and really think about the things that they're bringing up in this book. And, you know, it really made me appreciate certain things about it. I liked the way that he verbalized advice and attitudes that I am currently, you know, discovering or trying to employ myself. I also really liked the different turns of phrase and metaphors that were used in this book. While I didn't love every single thing about it, I do think there was some merit here, and I appreciate the fact that I got the chance to experience it this month. And I am interested to see how everyone else in the book club fared with this, because I really feel like this is more a personal experience than anything else. For my other buddy read, the one I do with Danica every month, which we have also been keeping up with very well, we decided to go for a book that I have heard so many things about. It's been so hyped. I know a lot of people love it, and I was curious, and I'm glad we finally read it, and that is The Serpent and the Wings of Night by Carissa Broadbent, which is the first book in the Crowns of Nyaxia series. This story is about Araya, who is the adopted human daughter of the Nightborn King, and of course she grows up around all these vampires, and she's basically prey, and the only way to really change her circumstances is for her to participate in a tournament called the Kajari, which is hosted by the Goddess of Night and gives the winner a chance to, I guess, have any boon of their choosing, any prize of their choosing. Of course, this is complicated by the fact that Araya is up against all sorts of vampires from all the vampiric houses, and at some point she ends up forming an alliance with someone unexpected in order to hopefully succeed at winning the tournament. You know, I think the biggest merit that this book has, in my opinion, is that I found the world and the lore really interesting. That was definitely something that reeled me in right from the start. And pairing that with a plot that was super easy to read, well-paced, and also just fun, and, you know, kind of like exciting because there were twists and turns, especially in the tournament, it just worked really well in tandem to be a book that I absolutely devoured when I picked it up. I liked the characters well enough in this book. I really enjoyed Araya and her stubbornness and her will to survive and to succeed at what she is aiming for, her natural distrust of the people surrounding her, and her tendency to prefer working alone because she's the only person she can trust, basically, is totally understandable considering her circumstances, but it was nice to see her start opening up to the people who become her allies eventually. It was just a good time. Yes, despite all of like the fighting and the action and the gore and the violence, this was a fun read. I really enjoyed the tournament setup. I tend to be a sucker for that in books, and that was no different here. I liked the way the tournament was set up, the different obstacles and challenges that these players had to face, and the residual consequences of each one. I honestly had no idea at first where it was going to go, and in fact I do think that the first couple of chapters are a little bit more slow as they establish the world and Araya's place in it and her relationships. But once things pick up, especially in the second half of this book, I was just like flipping pages because I wanted to know what would happen next. So I definitely found this one as engaging as many people have said it is, and I enjoyed it so much that we're just gonna roll right on to the next part, which is TBR. And I'm just gonna throw in the fact that I actually read the novella for this series, the one that comes right after this, called Six Scorched Roses. In Six Scorched Roses, we are actually following two completely different characters. There is Lilith, who is human, and there is Vale, who is a vampire, and she strikes a deal with Vale because she needs to find a cure to prevent this god's curse sickness that is pretty much decimating her entire town, including her sister. And so the deal is that she will give him 6 roses in exchange for 6 vials of his vampire blood, which she thinks could be the cure or could provide a basis for a cure. When I tell you I was not expecting to enjoy that novella as much as I did, I really mean it. I went into it just knowing I had to read it before I got to the sequel. But my goodness, I was just sucked right in. There was just something really appealing to me about Lilith and about Vale, and just seeing their interactions, seeing the details of this story sort of unfold the further in I got into the book. It was just so well done. I had no idea where the story was going to go, but I did appreciate where it ended up, and I also really enjoyed watching the relationship grow and shift and change between Lilith and Vale as the saga continued. And by the time I had finished the novella, I was super excited to see what role they were going to play in the main series. Which brings me to one of the first TBR books that I tackled in the month was, in fact, The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King by Carissa Broadbent. This is the sequel of the first duet in her Crowns of Nyaxia series, and it was so satisfying. Much like the first book, I do think the beginning is a little bit slower. I think that's also kind of understandable given where we left off in this one. Like, given where things lie at the end of this book, of course the beginning of this one would feel a little bit slower. But again, it follows that same formula of like eventually as things start to fall into place, we see the plot progressing, we see the action coming into play, and it just gets more and more exciting with higher stakes for these characters. I just needed to know what would happen next, to be honest, and I love that feeling when I'm reading a book, so that in and of itself made the reading experience of this one really good for me. We get even more world building and more lore. We learn more about the circumstances that the different vampire houses have found themselves in, but we also see more of Araya's actual history and see her grappling with more feelings that are complicated with regards to a variety of relationships in her life. And I appreciated that a lot. I thought it was pretty well done and well handled here. I love the way that it feels like this world has broadened within the scope of the plot of this particular book. We do get a satisfying conclusion, but there is clearly more to come from this world, and it just makes sense given the way it is set up here. I also found that I rooted for the romance a little bit more in this one. I understood why the characters were in the position they were at the start of this particular installment, but I was definitely rooting for that romance to develop and grow and maybe overcome the obstacles that lie in the way. The series was just a fun time. I'm glad I finally read it. I can totally see why a lot of people really love it, and I definitely am looking forward to the next book, which is coming out later this year, and it is about a character that I dearly adore in this series. Dearly adore, so I cannot wait to get to it. Since we've started talking about TBR books, let's just continue on in that vein. So the next one I'm gonna talk about is one that I believe I picked up when I saw Kristen from Merrily Kristen mention it like ages ago. And when I say ages ago, I mean like really ages ago. And that is Tokyo Fashion, which is basically an illustrated guide to Japanese style with suggestions for what pieces to acquire and how to wear them. Cons first, I guess. There's something a little bit inaccessible about the way this is done because it caters to a very specific aesthetic, and it also just doesn't really focus on body types or budget or stuff like that. It's pretty specific about like the two styles that they're recommending, which is, I think, cute and classic. It makes sense given that this is really based around Japanese fashion, I guess. Which is not to say that the advice offered in here is not stuff that isn't practical or can't be used. I do think that there were definitely some tips that I really liked and looks that I kind of want to emulate, and definitely informed by shopping when I was trying to update my wardrobe a little bit for spring. I do really like the illustration style. I like the way that she draws clothes and how they hang on people and the little comic bits. Those are all really fun. So overall, even though this is not like, for me, something that feels very definitive, I do find that I'm walking away from it with some style and wardrobe tips, and really that was all I wanted at the end of the day. Next off my TBR is a book by an author whose work I have read before, but I've never read her work in this genre. And the book is There Should Have Been Eight by Nalini Singh, which is a mystery thriller from this author. I've only ever read her long-running urban fantasy series, the Guild Hunter series, which I absolutely love. This one is about 7 friends who end up reuniting for a weekend at an old family estate belonging to one of them, and it has them hashing out the truth about what happened all those years ago when they lost the 8th member of their friend group. What I think particularly worked about this for me is the setting. I liked the gothic feel of that because they were at this very isolated estate with a ruined castle wing that also had a graveyard nearby, and it was just like this sense of eeriness and unease this entire time because it was really just them there and there was no one else around. And the inclement weather also was something that affected them. I believe there was like a rainstorm, and also that it snowed, and you know, it was just very isolating and eerie, and I think Nalini Singh captured that really well with her words. The other thing that I felt really contributed to that was the narrator of this book, because there is an unreliability there, because not just because of that narrator's bias, but because they, even though they're a keen photographer and can focus, in fact, on the details, they also are starting to lose their sight. There's just a sense that this narrator thinks they know what is going on, but then uncovers more information that kind of throws a wrench in the way they're thinking. And I also appreciated that a lot because it made me feel the way that I imagine stories in this genre should, which is like you have to feel uneasy and suspicious of everyone and everything around you because you just don't know who you can trust. It is almost a closed room mystery in a sense, and for that in and of itself, I really enjoyed it because those are the kinds of mystery thrillers that I tend to gravitate towards. In terms of how this wraps up and ends, however, I don't think I love it. I feel like it made sense. I mean, it's one way for the story to go, I guess, and I don't know. I still just feel a little weird about how it ended. It just didn't work for me or click as well as I would have liked it to. Overall, though, I did have a interesting time reading this because I just could not put it down once I'd started it because it was just that compelling and well written. It was a fun experience while it lasted, even though I didn't love the way it ended. There are 2 more TBR books left, and both of these books I absolutely loved, and they were total surprises to me because I honestly was not expecting to enjoy them as much as I did. The first one that I want to talk about is Sisters of Sword and Song, which is by Rebecca Ross, and if you recognize that name, yes, she is the author of A River Enchanted and Divine Rivals. This is another YA book that she published years ago, I want to say, probably around the time of the pandemic, actually. Evadne and Halcyon are the 2 sisters in this book, and Eva is super excited for Halcyon to come back home because she's been away training in the military of this world. But things go sideways when Eva and the rest of her family find out that Hal is actually on the run and is being charged for murder. When she is caught and tried, Eva volunteers to serve a part of Hal's sentence in order to figure out the truth of what really happened. When I tell you this book shocked me, I mean it, because I knew I was going to enjoy it, but I didn't anticipate enjoying it as much as I actually ended up doing. I was immediately just sucked into this world, for one thing. If there's anything that I know I can rely on when it comes to a Rebecca Ross book, it's just like knowing that within the first couple of chapters, I'm gonna be reeled into a world with its intriguing elements and things that I have questions about and things that I want to know more about. Like, there's just something in the way she chooses to write her descriptions and the details she chooses to grace us with very early on that have always succeeded in getting me really hooked on discovering more about where we're at and where these characters are from. In the case of this book especially, I think I was really drawn to it because it reminded me a little bit of Greek and Roman mythology, but also like the Italian countryside. Those are the elements that I felt immediately upon reading it, and that just felt really inviting to me as a reader. Another interesting thing about this one is that the plot that is described in this synopsis really only takes up maybe like a fourth of the book, and from there you actually have no idea what's going to happen next, or at least I didn't, and I really enjoyed the unfolding of that story. There were directions it went that I honestly wasn't expecting, but I just was along for the ride, really, and I think that's what served this story best in the end. It's that magical thing where there are definitely plot landmarks and directions and tropes that are being used here, but there's a very specific Rebecca Ross brand on top of those things that make it feel very unique to this story, which is what I'm always searching for when it comes to anything I read. It's basically like a nesting doll, this story, because it is about the two sisters, it is about Hal being on the run and then being caught and tried for murder, it is about Eva stepping in to save the day, but it's also about power plays and magical history and lore, and you know, there's so much happening here, more than I expected, and I just was content to flow along with the rest of the story, and it was a good time, and I was fully invested in these two sisters and what they were up to, the culmination of everything that they had been working towards since the start of the book. It was very, very good, and I'm so glad I finally got around to reading it. The last TBR book I need to mention is a piece of translated fiction that I wanted to read for ages, and then, you know, last month I just decided, hey, I'm gonna do this now, and I did, and it was magical. The book in question is The Cat Who Saved Books, which is by Sosuke Natsukawa, and it's translated by Louise Hill Kawai, I want to say. This very short novel is about Rintaro. After his grandfather passes, he knows his entire life is about to change because his aunt is taking guardianship of him and he's going to have to move away. Before he moves away, and the bookshop that he's basically grown up in and loves is, you know, sold off, he ends up on an unexpected adventure alongside this talking cat who leads him on a variety of missions where they are out to save books. This book felt like a Ghibli movie to me. It is the kind of magical and whimsical, grounded in real life emotions and feelings that the character is working through that I feel is a hallmark of a lot of Ghibli films, and I can totally see this in a Ghibli aesthetic in my head. Really, the only thing else that I want to say about this is how much I enjoyed that this was about readers, and it was a love letter to the people who read, the books we love, and reading as an act in and of itself. I loved the celebration of that in this story and the variety of ways we can choose to look at it, and obviously it was just delightful to follow along as Rintaro and this cat, and maybe other people they meet along the way, end up on all these sorts of adventures. I also appreciated that outside of this mission to save books in a variety of circumstances, we also have Rintaro actually being almost forced to confront the grief that he's feeling at the loss of his grandfather and his feelings about the changes that are about to happen in his life. It's subtle, but it's there, and I really appreciated that. This book was just, it felt magical, and it really swept me away when I was listening to it, because I actually listened to the audiobook, which was great, by the way. It was just one of those books where, like, when I read it, I was like, now that is a good book. And I genuinely am glad I read it, and I'm glad that I have it for my collection, and will happily read it again at some point. Okay, we're gonna talk about new releases now, and the first one that I actually finished in the month was The Encanto's Daughter, which is by Melissa de la Cruz. And this one has a main character who is half human and half Encanto. Her name is MJ, and she finds herself laying claim to her Encanto father's throne after his sudden death, only to discover that there are conspiracies and curses afoot in her disorganized court. This is a fun, quick YA fantasy read that was really entertaining. What is remarkable about it to me is getting to see Filipino culture and lore and mythology woven into the pages of such a story. I feel like we do see it more often now, but it's always fun for me to discover something new, or a story that's new that does that. I like the way we learn about it too in this world, or like readers can learn about it in this world, because it feels very organic, because MJ is learning about it and we learn alongside her, and that feels really organic. In terms of the plot, I did find it to be pretty predictable. It's your standard YA fantasy fair where you are an unexpected heir to this familial legacy, but also people are trying to kill you and may have killed people you love, and you have to figure out what's going on there. So you end up becoming like a detective and a ruler, and also just being a regular teenager at the same time. And if that sounds very shenanigan-y to you, it pretty much is. Outside of that, I also do think the characters were ultimately just alright as well. No standouts here. Much like the plot, they fill the typical role that they're meant to fill in the story. And I felt very similarly about the romance, which I could have rooted for if it had felt more well-developed. Alas, it did not, so it was just fine. Overall, it was a good time just for the fact that it's so refreshing all the time still, and I hope we get to a point one day where it's not refreshing, it just becomes like regular fare. It was refreshing to see the bits of Filipino culture sprinkled all throughout this story, and for that alone it was a good time. The next release I read, I actually picked up because of my friend DJ, but I had seen a lot of people get really excited about it when it first came out, and I'm glad I read it because it was so good. One of my favorite romances I've read this year so far, and that's Ready or Not, which is by Cara Bastone, which has this very spring cover. This is about Eve Hatch, who unexpectedly finds herself pregnant after a one-night stand, and she spends the next 9 months trying to figure out how to adjust to her new reality. She gets a whole lot of help along the way, including help from her best friend's older brother, Shep, who is also one of her childhood friends. I really enjoyed getting to know Eve and to see her grapple with the different obstacles that she's now facing. I loved her sense of humor, and I thought she was a really fun character to follow. I also really enjoyed her love interest. I think he is Chef's kiss. Amazing, and like the things he says and he does for Eve in this book just had me just emotional. I remember I was just like text yelling at DJ about it because like I could not keep myself silent because it was just that good. For a trope that I'm not normally into, which is surprise pregnancy, and also childhood friends to lovers is not always my thing, those two things were just done in a way that felt really refreshing. The perspective that Cara Bastone took with it and the direction she decided to run with it in all just really worked for me here. And it, you know, it was a story that sucked me right in, and I didn't expect to be as emotionally invested in it as I was, but like I was invested in everything. I was invested in Eve's pregnancy, her romantic relationship, her friendships, her relationship with her family, what she's going to decide to do. Each piece of the puzzle just felt equally important to me, and I really appreciated that. Also, bonus points because this is set in New York, and I also really just love the way it ends because it just felt right for this story. I remember I was like bawling my eyes out by the ending, if that's any indication of how I felt. So yeah, Ready or Not, great time, very emotional read for me. Surprised considering the tropes that are in it. All in all, very good surprise to have. The next book I read, I actually had for review from NetGalley, and that's Expiration Dates, which is by Rebecca Searle. Daphne Bell, every time she meets a new man, she always receives a slip of paper with his name and the amount of time that they're gonna end up together. Up until she meets Jake, where she gets a slip of paper, and it seems like this is gonna be the last person, the one that she's meant to be with. Thematically, this book was really interesting. I like that Expiration Dates made sense in terms of just an overall description of the different themes that you're going to find woven into the tale. I kind of want to read you my notes for this. It says, it's exploring allowing fate or someone else to dictate how you choose to act or feel, or as a security net because it prevents you from being hurt, or because it serves as a placebo to know that you get more time. The idea of choice in your life and being brave enough to face those choices, make them, and take the hurt and the pain, but also the joy and the love that may come along with it. I had high hopes for this one, honestly, because I've enjoyed other books that I've read from Rebecca Searle, but like there's just something about the way this one was written that didn't entirely work for me. There were still definitely lines that I thought were beautifully crafted and things that I wanted to highlight and remember, but overall, like in terms of the narrative structure and the characters and the plot itself, I just didn't necessarily love the execution of that. It was conceptually interesting, but the execution is where I just didn't feel like it clicked very well for me, and unfortunately that meant like it was one of the books that I found disappointing in the month of March. Next, we're gonna switch over to cozy fantasy, and I read Can't Spell Treason Without T by Rebecca Thorne. This one was not as cozy as I thought it was going to be, but we'll get to that in a second. One of the main characters, Reina, has had enough of the risks to her life as one of the queen's private guards, and so she finally agrees to run away with her girlfriend, Chianti, who happens to be a very powerful mage. They are going to run away somewhere remote so they can open a bookshop and tea shop together and, you know, just live life together. But it seems like the rest of the world doesn't want to make it easy on them. You know, I really appreciate that this is a book about characters who just want to escape from their day jobs because they're super stressful and causing them a lot of mental distress, because honestly, who of us has not fantasized about running away and, or, you know, running a bookshop somewhere or owning our own cafe? I know I have, especially in the last couple of years. Like, that has been a constant thing on my mind. It's not necessarily as cozy as I anticipated, because the setup and the planning and then the execution of the stuff for the shop happens pretty early on in the book. And you do get the cozy vibes when you're in there, but there's also a lot of high stakes stuff going on outside of it that involve magic and power plays and all sorts of things. And those things felt a little bit more stressful to me than I would have liked in a book that I thought was going to be like purely cozy fantasy. I was hoping for more slice of life moments, really, between our characters. And even though those are there, I think I wanted it to lean more towards that than towards the action and mystery stuff, so there's that. I did enjoy reading about the two main characters. We have Reina, who is a planner, and Chianti, who loves a good pun, and they were just enjoyable and heartwarming to read about. Not necessarily like new all-time favorites, but I did find them really charming, and I was definitely rooting for them to get like their sort of happy ending. And you know, this is a very readable book. I finished most of it in a day, and I'm pretty sure like any future books in the series, which there will be because the mystery is still not solved, I'm definitely going to have to pick up and check out for myself. So I'm glad that the next one in this series actually is coming out at the end of the year, so that'll be a good thing to look forward to. The next book is another one that I got through NetGalley. Also another one that didn't quite live up to any expectations that I had for it, and that is To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods, which is by Molly X. Chang. Main character Ru Ying is blessed by death with the power to pull life out of other people. In order to keep her family safe, she agrees to work as an assassin for the enemy prince, basically taking down any people that he says are getting in the way of a better world for both of their countries, even if she's not sure she can actually trust him. The stuff that I think is good first. There is potential here. There is something very readable about this author's writing, and her concepts for the world itself were interesting. Like this whole idea of the Roman Empire never falling and then getting scientifically advanced enough in order to figure out how to open a portal in the sky and travel through it into a new world. Those things are all very interesting. But where it fell flat was the execution again. The world building was a little bit underdeveloped in my opinion. It almost felt as if we were expected to already know certain things about the world from the get-go, even though, you know, we basically get just very little at the beginning about it, and then a few other things along the way. There probably could have been more. I don't know what more, but I feel like there could have been more. The plot, too, is very standard fantasy fare in terms of the direction of the events in the book. I feel like I have seen shades of this in other stories, and while that's, again, not something that I have a problem with, I do feel like I'm always searching for the thing that makes your version of it unique as a writer. The characters also felt a little underdeveloped. They were more caricatures of their various roles in the story than really characters I felt like I got to know on a personal level. So honestly, at the end of the day, it combined a lot of elements that felt underwhelming to me personally, and I ended up I was just like, this is okay, and I don't think I'll be continuing on with the series. I know there has been a lot of discussion about this book regarding the historical events that inspired it and the romantic part of it. The historical events I can't really speak to because I'm not as familiar with that part of history, but my opinion on the romance is because the characters are underdeveloped, their relationship, though I hesitate to call it that, is also something that felt underdeveloped. While I was reading, I was like, oh, there's not really much romance or romantic action until maybe like over halfway through the book. And even then, I already knew the direction it was going to take, so for me, I'm just like, it didn't feel like a romance, if that makes sense. Anyway, we're almost at the end. Okay, we're going to talk about another new release, and I'm excited to talk about this one. The specific reason that I wore this outfit is because this anime, Bleach, is something that this book called to mind when I was reading it. anyway, before I go on, the book is A Darker by Four, which is by June CL10. Rui is an exorcist in training who is determined to hone her magical abilities to avenge her mother's death. And then Yiren is the black sheep of an illustrious magical family who has no magic. But then an accident causes them to have a transference of power, and suddenly Yiren has Rui's magic and Rui has none. And this turns both of their worlds upside down. And honestly, from the beginning of this book, I was already like, this feels like a shonen anime. Like, all of the best parts, the parts that I love the most about shonen anime, it feels like they're getting incorporated into this story. And specifically the ones I think of when I think of this book are Jujutsu Kaisen and Bleach. Those are the two anime that the events in this book and the characters in this book and sort of the structure of the story in this book kind of reminded me of while I was reading, and it was just, those are two that I love, so it was really exciting. Honestly, this book was just a blast to read. I liked following along as Rui and Yiren tried to figure out what to do with their new circumstances, how Yiren had to sort of embrace that and start training at the magical school for like exorcist, and Rui had to figure out how she was going to get her magic back. We also have them learning more about the exorcist society as well as the underworld, and in fact they end up getting swept up in the mystery of one of the missing kings or gods of the underworld, and it's just fun. It was just plain fun, and this was helped along by the fact that there's so much banter exchange here. Like, there's bickering too, but it's like the amicable kind of bickering, which happens a lot in shonen anime, but more than that, there was a lot of banter and a lot of teasing, which always a good thing for me. I really like the magical lore of this story too. Like, that aspect of it was really fascinating to me, as I tend to be drawn to stories like that where the underworld plays a prominent role, and then there's also magical abilities in tier levels and stuff like that, and you can use it as weaponry to fight as well, and you know, all of that was just such fascinating stuff. I loved getting to know the characters too. There's actually an ensemble cast in this, but we primarily follow Yiren and Rui. We also get to meet some other people who I really love. My personal favorites are actually none of these main characters per se. I really just love the others so much, and I hope we see them in book 2 because yes, this is a duology. There's a lot of different personalities in this book, and I think as someone who enjoys a good ensemble cast, that was a fun time as well. Like, all in all, this was a very entertaining urban fantasy adventure, and it just gave me those anime vibes that I wanted. It let me have a good time, gave me a new cast of characters to fall in love with, had some great anime nods, and I've heard that there are also nods to BTS and a few other things, which you can find on the author's website. But yeah, it was a good time. It was such a good time, and I am just sad that I'm gonna have to wait an entire year before I get the next book. But yeah, highly recommend checking this out. Okay, we're almost at the end of this video. Now we're gonna talk about manga. This is gonna be pretty brief. Let's talk about the manga that I don't own first. So I actually finally, everybody cheer, I finally finished reading Attack on Titan. I read volumes 28 through 34. If you have never heard of Attack on Titan is about Eren Yeager, who lives in a world where humanity has to reside in cities surrounded by walls in order to protect them from the man-eating humanoid titans. One day, a titan breaches the wall, ends up killing Eren's mother, and so Eren vows that he is going to wipe out all the titans and get revenge for his mother's death. It starts there, gets way more complicated as the series goes on, but first and foremost, I have to say I cannot believe I finally finished reading this manga. Unlike many of the other series that I have binged over the years, I found that this one I had to read it in chunks just because the events in it were so heavy. Both the actual things that happened in it and also thematically what it meant for the story. And I feel like I always had to take an unplanned break before I could get back to reading it. But I finally decided I needed to know how it ended. And honestly, I think it's really satisfying. I actually had an inkling that part of the ending was going to happen. I don't know why I felt that way, but like I feel like it was the natural direction that it was going to take. When it actually happens in the manga, I was like, this makes sense, even though I was still kind of raging and upset about it. There's a lot of like very exciting, heart-pounding stuff that occurs in these last couple of volumes, but also, and you know, I shouldn't have been surprised at this point because I'd already read 27 volumes prior to this year, but there were also a lot of unexpected turns that this took that I did not see coming, which is always exciting in this kind of story. I am glad I finally finished this manga series. I can see why everyone loves it. I can really appreciate it for the storytelling and for the themes and for the character work. I think this mangaka has done an incredible job bringing that story to life on these pages, and yeah, it was epic. That's pretty much all I got to say about that. Speaking of epic, I also finally finished reading all the omnibus volumes of Fushigi Yogi, which is by Yu Watase. And I must say, this was an interesting experience because I did not realize that the main storyline actually ends in the 5th omnibus, and that there is a secondary storyline which is featured in one of the OAVs that takes place during this omnibus volume and part of the 5th one. What I will say about Fushigi Yogi is, like, there are definitely elements of it that I think were stand out and still feel stand out today. The character work that's done in it, the way the plot is structured, and the twists and turns as these individuals navigate the adventure that they're on. Oh, I didn't even remind you guys what it was about. Anyway, the Fushigi Yogi series actually centers around this main character, Miyaka Yuki. She and her best friend Yui are sucked into a book known as the Universe of the Four Gods, and when they're there, Miyaka finds out that she is the priestess of Suzaku, which means she can summon Suzaku and make some wishes, and the emperor of Konan, which is the land that, you know, pays tribute and honors Suzaku, needs her to make those wishes in order to save the empire, and it kind of goes from there. I've always been a fan of the structure of this story, where you're on a journey quest. Like, I am a journey quest girl. I enjoy that, and that happens fairly frequently in Fushigi Yogi world, so that's a good time. I also just love these characters so much, so getting more page time with them is always a treat to me. I love seeing the expressions and hearing them talk and seeing their dialogue with each other, and this time I got to tab some of my favorite panels and interactions as well. I love the found family vibes of the story, and of course I'm a huge fan of the romance as well. I will say there are definitely some comments and some attitudes in this, and even some parts of the storyline, that I don't think have aged very well. Some of it was definitely unnecessary, in my opinion. I don't know if at the time the author just felt like it would lend the air of gravitas and drama that she needed to make a point. But personally, for me, there were some parts where I was like, did it really have to be like that? Did it really have to feature those things? And I would suggest checking for content warnings if that's something that you want to know about prior to going in. But as someone who nostalgically has watched the anime multiple times and already knows they love these characters, I just really enjoyed being on this adventure with them all over again, despite the stress and heartbreak that it also caused me. It was a good time, and I'm glad I finally finished the series in manga form. And then we got to talk real quick about a series I started rereading because I want to get caught up on it, and that is Spy X Family, which is by Tatsuya Endo. So this one is about this guy over here. He is a master spy named Twilight, or codenamed Twilight, and his latest mission is to prevent a war between two countries by making contact with a key person who could affect that. And in order to do so, he has to infiltrate a private school, which is pretty elite, and he can only do that if he has a wife and a daughter, and that's where his mission begins. I reread 3 volumes in March, and it was so fun. These are rereads for me, and even though I knew what was going to happen, it did not stop me from being delighted by the way Tatsuya Endo opens this series. It truly has, in spades, chaos and action and heart and humor, and like, all of these things are just thrown together in a concoction that feels so perfect and so wonderful and just right up my alley. I love getting to know these characters all over again. I love getting to know Lloyd and Yor and Anya and Bond and everyone else who's showing up, and it is just a fun time. I also would really like to get caught up on the anime because I'm a little behind on that as well, but for now my focus will be on getting caught up to the 11th volume of the series. Such a good time. Definitely would recommend checking it out. And last but not least, we're going to talk about my 2 rereads, and it is Sarah J. Maas related. If you didn't know already, by the way, I am doing a Mass Effect read-along with my friend Bethany and a couple of other individuals. The link to Bethany's video explaining everything is down below. We already did one live show for Throne of Glass, and this month, towards the end of it, we're doing one for Crown of Midnight. But the 2 books that I finished were Empire of Storms and Tower of Dawn, and if you're asking how my feelings are after reading both these books, I will tell you that they are suffering from the whiplash of the emotional roller coaster ride that these stories take me on. Every time I revisit this series, I just find something new to appreciate about it, and this time it is a lot of the foreshadowing that connects it to other things, as well as the different character work, or the amount of character work that has gone into fleshing out these individuals who feel like real friends to me, people that I love and care for and care about, and it's just been a good time, honestly, and I have no complaints about revisiting the series, and I'm just happy about it. Yeah, that's really all I got for you on that front. Finally, those are all the books that I read in the month of March, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me chat a little about them. If you've got any additional questions or comments or just want to say hey, please feel free to leave a comment down below. And you can find me online as well on other platforms, all under Alexa Loves Books. If you want more up-to-date information on what I'm reading or my thoughts on what I'm reading, I would suggest following me on Goodreads and Instagram specifically, as I update more over there. And with that, I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!